Hi everyone, my name is Margarita Boyarskaya, and I'm going to give you a little preview into our tutorial titled What is a Proxy and Why is it a Problem? This is joint work with Professor Solon Barocas at Microsoft Research and Cornell University, as well as with Hanna Wallach at Microsoft Research. And we're also lucky to be joined by Michael Carl Tschantz, who has very related work presented also during the main conference program. So please make sure to catch that. Okay, so the discussion of proxy variables and indirect discrimination and related concerns is not new, but we will present to you the distinction between this old legacy way of talking about proxy discrimination and a more recent version of this problem, which we think is quite specific to algorithmic fairness, machine learning, and statistical prediction. So the longstanding concern with indirect discrimination in proxy variables has most to do with intentional discrimination on the basis of a known stand-in. So this is a way to create plausible deniability, conceal potentially nefarious intentions, and cloak illegal conduct. It's also a way to discriminate even potentially when you don't have access to the legally prescribed variable. One example of this in economics is redlining. Redlining is when a decision maker wants to discriminate on the basis of race for some target decision, for example, for approving people for loans, or enabling their access to voting polls. But instead of discriminating directly using the prescribed feature, such as race, they do it using a proxy, such as zip code, because in the United States, the distribution of people's zip codes is closely associated with their race. Okay, and the more recent concern with proxy variable, however, has more to do with unintentional discrimination via correlated variables. Here, a likely proscribed variable can be redundantly encoded via other seemingly benign variables. And what makes this particularly important in the context of machine learning is that the problem might not just rest with an individual variable or several of them, each of which exhibits strong correlation with the omitted sensitive attribute. But it may well be the case that a set of otherwise unsuspicious covariates together jointly act as a proxy for the prescribed feature. So you can see this new turn in the way the debate on proxies has shifted in the way the community responded to a somewhat recent regulatory proposal by the HUD. HUD is the Department of Housing and Urban Development. It is a federal regulator in the United States that oversees discrimination law compliance in the domain of housing. So they recently proposed this amendment to a rule that they had, and I will quote this to you. A defendant or responding party may establish that a plaintiff's allegations do not support a prima facie case of discriminatory effect if the defendant shows that factors do not rely in any material part on factors that are substitutes or close proxies for protected classes under the Fair Housing Act, and that the model is predictive of credit risk or other similar valid objective. So on regulations.gov, you can see a vast amount of responses that experts, including legal scholars and CS scholars, submitted in reaction to this proposed change. And if you just filter these responses by the presence of the keyword proxy or proxies, you will see that many commentators raise exactly the concerns that we've been bringing up earlier in this presentation, which is that it is completely inadequate to just examine variable by variable and determine for each of them whether it correlates with the sensitive attribute. That simply is not a good way to capture the potential threat of discrimination that people tend to worry about in the context of AI. Even more recently, a federal trade commissioner wrote a paper that laid out a version for how the regulators may go about addressing fairness concerns in AI context. And a remarkable statement from the paper is this: proxy discrimination that results in disparate impact is always pernicious, whether or not we can identify underlying intent, and it can and should give rise to legal liability, even if it is not intentional. This is a very strong statement. This, together with the HUD formulation, are perhaps some of the few and early mentions of the proxy variables explicitly as a separate concern and not as part of the general disparate treatment, disparate impact discussion. So this is very much a live debate in policymaking. Now, many of you know that there are two main doctrines that govern and guide the legal treatment of algorithmic discrimination in the United States. Disparate treatment has to do with explicitly considering a sensitive attribute or with an intention to discriminate. So even the original form of redlining counted as disparate treatment because it intentionally uses a proxy. Now, disparate impact is slightly different. It has to do with unjustified way of making decisions that result in disparity, or a way of making decisions that result in disparity and could have been avoided or are in principle avoidable. This new form of proxy concern that we want to highlight is often characterized by lack of intent to discriminate. So it doesn't fit well with either disparate treatment or disparate impact because it is neither intentional nor formal. The sensitive feature is not directly used, so disparate treatment just doesn't seem to offer much. Disparate impact is a bit confusing because the features may accurately predict the outcome of interest, the proxies may do so. And so we may well be able to justify disparate impact because of predictive validity, which is another way to interpret criterion validity, something that is mentioned verbatim in the EEOC uniform guidelines. But so the proxy discrimination may spill through the cracks of both, including disparate impact and disparate treatment doctrines, because proxy may be demonstrably predictive of the outcome. So the point is that disparate treatment is good at capturing old concerns with proxies, but disparate impact does not. And predictive validity could be a way to defend proxy use for many real-life machine learning applications. So proxy discrimination appears to be a tricky case for the law. Okay, a little bit of notation. We will use X to refer to non-prescribed variables. We will refer to A as the prescribed or the sensitive feature, and Y will be the outcome or the quality that we are aiming to estimate. Proxy discrimination, in the way it is interesting to computer science and lawyers, also does not make a tidy fit for existing theory. There are other areas of expertise where there has been discussion of proxy-related concerns. Notably, in econometrics and statistics, scholars talked about taste-based or statistical discrimination, but both try to capture intentional and not unintentional discrimination. So they are both narrowly focused on disparate treatment flavor of discrimination. I also want to highlight the difference between the typical setup in econometrics discussion of proxies versus the machine learning talk on proxies. So in econometrics, a typical setup involves a sensitive feature, A, that correlates with the proxy variable, and the proxy correlates with the outcome. So the true variable that we would like to have access to as decision makers is X, so the proxy, which may actually even not be problematic in and of itself. So for example, the decision maker lacks access to criminal records, so they consider race as the basis for inferring the trustworthiness of a job candidate. This is clearly not an example that is unproblematic, but it is a real life example. So here, X is omitted, the criminal record is omitted, and one uses A, race, in lieu of X. Now, on the other hand, standard setup for machine learning is when X correlates with the sensitive feature. The sensitive feature correlates with the outcome, and the outcome is the covariate that is omitted. For example, a model may not include gender for lack of access, but we consider hair length in order to predict fit for a job that, for example, involves employees having to move heavy objects around. Okay, so we mentioned that one way to possibly circumvent disparate impact allegations if someone had that nefarious intention is by saying that predictive validity of a proxy for the outcome is justifying its use. People seem to generally not be satisfied with this criterion validity argument. What is the reason for this? Well, they will say the proxy only predicts the outcome because it is a proxy for the sensitive attribute. And so in absence of further clarification, it's a little hard to understand what that truly means. We think that the essence of this claim is that there is no causal story that could reasonably explain the relationship between X and Y. and how come X ends up being predictive of Y, other than via A. So X must be associated with Y only because it is associated with A. An extreme case of this is when X is completely useless for predicting Y after controlling for A. And for example, hair length for a job fit is an illustration of this extreme case. So once you make this claim that X predicts Y because X is a proxy for A, how do you then argue that this is wrong? You could argue that this really, in essence, is a case of indirect form of disparate treatment, because in fact, predictions are actually based on the sensitive attribute on A. Or you could argue that this is a form of unjustified disparate impact, because the predictions are based on a covariate that is not truly related to Y in a meaningful sense. And thus, possibly, we could replace it with an alternative for this practice. So now let's drill down on what it means to say X is not truly related to Y. So part of this is provoked by law scholarship that makes this argument pretty explicitly. The work of Paul and Kim, James Grimmelman, and Daniel Westreich makes this argument that we should not accept a model that produces disparate impact if we do not understand why X predicts the target. These scholars talk about a demand that X plausibly be related to Y. And our view, indirectly supported by this legal scholarship, is that there is indeed difference between statistical relevance, which is based on correlation, and subjective relevance, which could be understood as something like, you should be able to tell a story, plausible story about why X is predictive of Y. So there appears to be a conceptual confusion. You could take the view that your proxy variable X stands in for the sensitive feature A. So this is the case where X in and of itself, you cannot quite explain why it would be predictive of Y, of the target. So it has to be due to A. And then the appropriate response that suggests itself is to replace A with a direct measurement of some other genuinely relevant latent variable, X2. I should clarify that if one suspects that A is predictive of the outcome, then in the context of algorithmic fairness, where A is often an immutable characteristic like race, gender, disability, and so on, it really is quite difficult to convince yourself that such features in and of themselves can truly be the cause of any outcome. Most likely there is indeed some other latent unobserved feature. For example, in the case where hair length is used to predict your fitness for a job that involves physical labor, maybe it's your upper body strength that is that X2 that you ought to be collecting instead of hair length and instead of gender. Now, you could also take the view that if X reflects discrimination on the basis of A, past historical discrimination, that's what makes it a proxy problem. And here, the imperative is then to limit the model to only those covariates that are insulated from past discrimination on the basis of the prescribed feature. So here's an illustration of these two cases using directed acyclic graphs. On the left, you're only observing X1, the original proxy, and the target. And indeed, the proper thing to do if X1 is hair length and Y is warehousing job fit is then to collect X2 instead, X2 being upper body strength. On the right-hand side, because X3, despite being directly relevant for the job, is in itself downstream of past historical discrimination, the correct solution might be not to use it at all and instead just focus on other predictors that are insulated from past discrimination. Okay, and now imagine the kind of joint version of the two cases. If, like in the first case, X1 is not clearly relevant to the target, and you have this other covariate X2, but then you make it a little bit more complicated by assuming that X2 also is directly associated with A only due to historical discrimination, then actually just using X2 instead of X1 normatively wouldn't improve your model very much. So I leave you with this. Dealing with proxies by substitution can be done with or without concerns about insulation from historical injustice. You can replace the contentious proxy with another variable that you feel better about. And the reasons for feeling better about it can be several or a combination of, for example, observing that the new variable happens to improve the accuracy of predictions, or observing that it happens to minimize the differences in accuracy across groups, or maybe this new variable correlates with A more weakly, or it reduces disparate impact, or maybe it simply seems subjectively more relevant to the task. Alternatively, a more strict approach is to substitute this variable or just completely omit it and keep only those variables that seem to be insulated from past discrimination. And under such an approach, perhaps the members of a protected group are not held accountable for the value of X for which they are not responsible. And this doesn't compound past injustice by subjecting members of the sensitive groups to less favorable treatment, given that the value of the covariate itself is the result of past discrimination. However, it could be argued that pretty much anything that we're likely to measure is downstream of past historical discrimination. Also in this workshop, we will include in the live version some discussion of existing methods for addressing proxy discrimination, and we will have an exciting component by a colleague, Michael Carl Tschantz, who happened to have been independently developing his own treatment of the proxy variables problem. Please do catch his talk during the main conference presentation, and as part of our live tutorial, he will introduce some of the elemental properties that he distilled as being relevant to thinking about proxy variables in your model. Thank you very much for your time.